Welcome again. I keep seeing people panic about autism rate numbers. In this episode, I'm going to be deconstructing this autism epidemic myth by showing how culture and biology are working together to create autism and neurodivergence. Before we start, could you please click the bell to subscribe? And if you know someone who will find this content useful, please can you share it with them? To understand the rapid rise in autism cases, we need to look at the history and how our understanding of autism has evolved over the years. All the way back in 1911, the term autism was made. It was used to describe a group of children who appeared to have schizophrenia. How things were at the start is extremely different to what autism is seen as today. I'm going to begin by talking about the diagnostic criteria and changes which have been made over the years. At first, it was believed only boys can be autistic, so at first all girls were removed from the picture, bringing limitations to how many people could be diagnosed as autistic. In the 1950s, just after World War II and the Nazi Holocaust, autistic people were still institutionalized, so autism was not in the sight of the public, making it appear that there's no such thing as autism. At the time, only people with ASD-3, as we call it today, or profound autism, were diagnosed as autistic. It was estimated to be somewhere between 1 in 2.5 thousand and 1 in 10,000 people to be autistic. In the past, it was believed people can't have both epilepsy and autism at the same time. People couldn't have ADHD and autism at the same time. And we see today epilepsy and ADHD are two of the most common disabilities people on the autism spectrum are diagnosed with. This would reduce autism rates by at least 50%. Before the 1980s, people couldn't be diagnosed as autistic if they were over 30 months old. This would make lots of autistic people fall through the cracks, so all adults are removed from the picture. In the US, it's said autism rates are 1 in 31 people today. Let's use this information to see what the rates would have been in the past. It's estimated 1/4 of autistic people are female. Since girls couldn't be autistic, according to the past, we can reduce the autism rates by 25%. That will take us to 1 in 124 people. That's quite a leap. Approximately between 30 and 40% of autistic people have epilepsy, and a great deal of autistic people without epilepsy have ADHD. That will be about 60% of autistic people. So we can reduce the rate from 1 in 124 people by 60%, and that takes us to 3 in 620 people. Due to a lack of awareness in the past, we would rarely identify someone as autistic when they are under 30 months old. So I would estimate about 80% of people would have been missed. So we can reduce the autism rate from 3 in 620 people by 80%, and that takes us to 3 in 775 people are autistic. Autism has lots of overlapping symptoms to other disabilities, and autism has a very narrow definition in the past. Evidence shows the vast majority of autistic people were missed or misdiagnosed. That will be about 90%. So the rate would go from 3 in 775 people to 9 in 3,875 people. That fits in between the estimated 1 out of 2,500 and 1 out of 10,000. There were fewer psychiatrists in the past, so more people wouldn't be diagnosed. So we calculate in the 1970s time, the autism rate would be less than 0.5% of the US. There are about 200 million people in the US. 0.5% of 200 million is just 1 million people. If you look at this graph, the bar on the left is people born in the 1950s, and the right is people born after 2010. All the green and orange on the left bar represent people who were autistic, who were already here, but they were either missed or misdiagnosed. The blue on the left is Leo Connor's narrower version of autism. I'm just going to show you a video where Professor Alicia A. Broderick shows a timeline of how the diagnosis rates have risen.
So how did we get from the 11 children, first identified by Leo Connor in 1943 as autistic, to the billion-dollar autism industries that are booming today? We got here via the 20th century labors and the ongoing 21st century labors of the AIC. So here's a very quick timeline to illustrate. Okay, 1943, Leo Connor identified autism in the US. 1952, the second edition of the DSM included autism as a psychiatric diagnosis. Putting it in as a psychiatric diagnosis placed it squarely within the purview of child psychiatrists to diagnose autism. Primarily, that diagnosis was only applied to children who were already living in institutional settings and under the care of a child psychiatrist. Okay, 1980, the revision, the DSM-3, autism was reclassified not as a psychiatric disorder, but rather as a developmental disorder. What impact did that have? Well, now the diagnostic gaze, if you will, is now within the purview of pediatricians, not just child psychiatrists working in institutional settings. Now we're bringing into the diagnostic dragnet, we're bringing pediatricians, right? So every child is going for well child visits. We're going to have a lot more people having their eyes on, going through checklists, classifying kids as autistic. 1987, the DSM-3R broadened the diagnostic criteria for autism, right? They added, for example, the catch-all category of pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. That one was important because it enabled the diagnosis of kids who we first sort of looked at and started wondering about and evaluating over the age of 30 months, right? The previous autism diagnosis, all of this had to be in place before the child was 30 months of age. So that broadened it again. Probably more kids are going to get caught in that diagnostic gaze. 1990, we added autism as a category of eligibility to federal special education law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, right? So now our diagnostic gaze is expanded further. It now includes educators and also parents, knowing this is a category of eligibility. My kid might be eligible for it. You might want to have your kid evaluated. We might want to send them to the school-based child psychologist, okay? We're adding more people to actively participate in the diagnostic gaze. 1994, it gets broadened again. The DSM-4 established autism spectrum disorder, which, by the way, appeared to be a sort of a test balloon because we now have things like depressive disorders and schizophrenia, and others are now using this spectrum conceptualization apparently successfully, right? And then in 2013, the DSM-5 tidied up a few things, removed Asperger's, et cetera, and the changes that came out last month are really not having much impact on this conversation. Okay, so in the first 70 years of the existence of autism as an idea, as a concept, as a thing, the diagnostic criteria and the professionals involved in diagnostic processes were broadened or expanded no fewer than 5 or 6, depending on how you want to count it, but let's say no fewer than 5 times. I don't call that an epidemic. I call that manufacturing a market.
Just to give some additional detail, in the 1980, a child psychiatrist in the UK, Lorna Wing, was able to access the works of Hans Asperger. Asperger had a wider view of autism than did Connor. Lorna Wing worked with the American Psychiatric Association, and on the 1994 revision, Asperger syndrome was added to the DSM. If you look at this graph on the x-axis in the year 1952, the line gets steeper. Then look to 1980 and see it begin to rise again. then look at 1994 and see that the diagnosis rates rapidly rise. This should illustrate to you that what we are seeing today calling ASD-free or profound autism was and still is only a fragment of the autism spectrum. Before 1994, it shows less than 500 autistic people were born a year, and after 1994, it goes into the thousands per year. Evolution doesn't occur that quickly. Nothing genetic can multiply as quickly as that. So there'll still be around 500 ASD-free born each year, but the graph showed 3,000 in 2010, so now 15 years later, it's probably about 4,000 per year born autistic, so about 1/8, 12.5% of autistic people are likely ASD-free, but we could round it up to 20% just in case, so only about 1/5 of the autism spectrum could be put in the category of profound autism, and we rather see it divided into subcategories, but at the minute we've only got ASD1, ASD2 and ASD3, but if you look at this chart, you'll see that there's 5 subtypes, Asperger's syndrome included. But once we got to 2013, all 5 of those that were just on that graph, on that chart, all got clushed into one umbrella, ASD, autism spectrum disorder. So it should be clear that the changes to diagnostic criteria is one of the many causes of the increase of autism rates. Autism researchers and science has shown autism has been among our population for hundreds of thousands of years, before we were even humans. If autism has been here all this time, why couldn't we see it until the 20th century? To answer this question, we need to look back to the 19th century again. The first thing we need to acknowledge is that all disorders and disabilities are human classifications. They are constructed by cultural evolution. Autism is a construction by us. Our cultures have made these disorders to try and make sense of the world around us. Disorder is not natural. In 1835, a French statistician, Adolphe Quetelet, came up with the ideology of the average man. Is the perfect man. Quetelet said, I quote, "If the average man were perfectly established, one could consider him as the type of beauty. Everything that was furthest from resembling his proportions or his manner of being would constitute deformities or illnesses. Anything that was so different, not only in its proportions, but in its form, as to stand outside the limits observed, would constitute monstrosity." End of quote. The 19th century, someone called Francis Galton came up with the desire to improve the human race through what he called selective breeding, more commonly known as eugenics. To improve the human race, they had to come up with a way to measure the value of a human. Francis Galton used Adolphe Quetelet's idea of the average man. Galton renamed the normal distribution curve as regression to the average. Here's an image of the normal distribution curve. This is being used to measure intelligence, as across the x-axis we see numbers 70, 100 and 130. Galton divided the bell curve into quartiles, with the average at the centre. This is how we made intellectual disability. 70 was one of the points of a quartile, so they saw it as inferior. The term normal wasn't in common use until 1840. Before, normal was a mathematical term to describe perpendicular. The concept of disorder can only exist if we have order. Averages were used to create an order that got called normal. This redefined health. Health is generated by a balanced relationship between body, mind, and environment. When we have a harmonious relationship with our environment, our health can flourish. The average man cannot account for human diversity, our biodiversity. We wouldn't believe in premature death if we didn't standardize humanity with statistics. The formal statistical approach to measuring premature mortality traces back, at least to thinkers like the German statistician Wilhelm Leixis in the late 19th century. Leixis suggested measuring premature mortality by analysing the age distribution of deaths, proposing that in an ideal scenario, the distribution should be symmetric. The formal conceptualization of premature death as a normative concept and public health metric is more recent, evolving significantly in the 19th and 20th centuries. Applying statistics to human health created normal people which co-produced abnormal people. Normal was never defined. Pathologists define normal by saying what is not abnormal. The rule appeared to be that socially undesirable behaviours are abnormal, making the opposite normal. Health was politicised by social policy. Anyone who didn't fit the social norm was pathologised. Dr. Nick Walker writes, I quote, "The choice to frame the minds, bodies and lives of autistic people or any other neurological minority group in terms of pathology does not represent an inevitable and objective scientific conclusion, but is merely a cultural value judgment. Similar pathologizing frameworks have been used time and time again to lend an aura of scientific legitimacy to all manner of other bigotry, and to the oppression of women, indigenous peoples, people of colour, and queer people, among others. The framing of autism and other minority neurological configurations as disorders and conditions, it begins to lose its aura of scientific authority and objectivity when viewed in this historical context. For some years prior to the American Civil War, the desire of slaves to escape from slavery was diagnosed by some white Southern physicians as a medical disorder called drapetomania." End of quote. The very fact that biological normalization had to be normalized in and of itself is evidence that normal never was normal to begin with, as you can't normalize something if it is already normal. Dr. Gavin Maté writes, I quote, "When I got into psychiatry, Dr. Perry told me, it became clear really quickly that the diagnoses were not connected to the physiology, that they were just descriptive, and that there were hundreds of physiological routes to someone having an attention problem, for example. And yet the profession acted as if these descriptive labels were really a thing. I knew that if we were doing research, if we were using these hollow descriptors, which we call diagnoses, and then study interventions and outcomes, we would just get garbage. And that's what we've done." End of quote. Inventing normal people changed health from a scientific concern into a political concern. I turned this political version of health into a concept I called societal pathology. As we look back through cultural changes, it is visible culture is the judge. Culture, through its social norms, decides who's pathological, not health itself. If we relied on science, we wouldn't have come to the belief homosexuality is a mental illness. If that belief was scientific, a political movement would not be able to change the facts. Nick Walker also says, I quote, "Through the lens of the neurodiversity paradigm, the pathology paradigm's medicalized framing of autism and various other constellations of neurological, cognitive, and behavioral characteristics as disorders or conditions can be seen for what it is, a social construction rooted in cultural norms and social power inequalities, rather than a scientifically objective description of reality. End of quote. If we are to be scientific about the concept of normal, there's only one possible objective norm: human diversity. By redefining health into a statistical, one-size-fits-all model, we have pathologized the norm. Any pieces of human diversity our cultures found undesirable start to be seen as disorders, diseases, and disabilities. That's where autism has come from: cultural norms. Cross-cultural studies of autism have shown that culture shapes the way families, professionals, and communities understand and treat developmental disabilities. The interpretations and treatments of autism are particularly susceptible to the influence of culture. Diagnosing autism relies heavily on behavioral criteria, and behavioral norms vary considerably across cultures. In a way, we are actually the directors of human evolution. Cultural evolution influences human evolution. Natural evolution is about adaptation to environmental changes. I think we can sometimes overlook that cultural changes are actually environmental changes themselves. This doesn't just apply to adapting to a new environment, it includes adapting to new social settings and frameworks. If you carefully compare today's culture to past cultures, you will see we have stopped healthy daily activities and habits and adopted some unhealthy ones, producing an unhealthy culture. Adapting to an unhealthy culture will make us unhealthy. When we compare various areas of the world to one another and pay close attention to cultural diversity, we can see humans have undermined culture itself, with numerous causes of health issues and disabilities. Current data suggests that high-income countries have higher reported rates of autism than low and middle-income countries. The difference is primarily attributed to disparities in awareness, access to healthcare, diagnostic capacity, and cultural factors, rather than a difference in the actual underlying number of autistic people. As a result, modern daily activities that constitute a so-called normal life are the very causes of disorder and disease. Causes to health problems have become hegemonic. Hegemony refers to the dominance of one group, state, or entity over others, often characterized by political, cultural, or economic power. As Nick Walker said in the previous chapter, looking from the neurodiversity paradigm, we can see disorders and conditions as sociological constructs rooted in cultural norms and social power inequalities. If you look at this graph, you'll see wealthier and more traditional countries, known to have stricter cultural norms, have higher report rates of autism. The World Health Organization estimates that globally, about 1 in 100 children has autism, but this is just an average, and the true prevalence in many regions of the world is still largely unknown and likely underestimated. In developing nations, while the reported rates are higher in developed nations, the scientific consensus is that the actual genetic predisposition to autism is globally consistent, with variations in reported prevalence reflecting diagnostic capacity and social factors rather than biological differences. A good example to illustrate this is the Amish community. Cultural and religious beliefs within the Amish community can impact the early recognition and diagnosis of autism. Some behaviours associated with autism may be attributed to variations in personality or character instead of being considered a developmental disability. This lack of awareness or understanding can delay diagnosis and intervention. The Amish community values conformity and traditional practices, which can create challenges in accepting and understanding the unique needs of individuals with autism. We know that a characteristic of autism is, I quote, restrictive and repetitive behaviours. And we know that most autistic boys tend to be systematic. Traditional practices are restrictive, repetitive, and systematic patterns of cultural behaviour. So the majority of the Amish community actually conform to the autistic community. By doing so, the signs of autism are seen as social behaviours instead of social deficits, making it appear that no one does have autism, which is where this misconception that the Amish community does not have autism comes from. Harry Neiman points out, I quote, disability has always been contextual. Many individuals who are today diagnosed with learning difficulties or intellectual disabilities would not have been considered such in a society before universal literacy, for example. Tomorrow's social and technological progress may lead to still new disabilities, demonstrating that the quest to eliminate disability will always be a moving target. Such changes may leave humanity less equal, less diverse, and perhaps even less human. End of quote. Social media has become a universal source of information and communication, but social media leads to great levels of cyberbullying and results in anxiety, stress, and depression, according to university studies all around the globe. Anxiety, stress, and depression are major contributing factors towards all kinds of disabilities, disorders, and diseases. In the past, we communicated more in person, having stronger relationships and connections. We now find ourselves by habit scrolling down the phone, finding ourselves being bombarded with bad news, just clicking a reaction while simultaneously socially isolating ourselves. Psychiatrist Peter D. Kramer writes, I quote, depression is associated with brain disorganization and nerve cell atrophy. Depression appears to be progressive. The longer the episode, the greater the anatomical disorder. To work with depression is to combat a disease that harms patients' nerve pathways day by day. Nor is the damage merely to mind and brain. Depression has been linked with harm to the heart, to endocrine glands, to bones. Depressives die young, not only of suicide, but also of heart attacks and strokes. Depression is a multi-system disease, one we would consider dangerous to health, even if we lacked the concept of mental illness. End of quote. I would say, considering how many people are consuming antidepressants, it's no need to wonder, and we can conclude that depression is one of the major causes of the big increase of chronic illness, chronic disease in our globe today. Biological studies have shown an association between parental age at the child's birth. The older parents are, the more likely they'll have a child with a developmental disability. In the past culture, especially Christian cultures, how to live was more traditional than individualistic. People used to have children by the age of 20. At the age of 20, the pregnant woman's body would still be functioning well. But in today's culture, it's perceived that it's better to have a full education and career before you have children. Due to the social justice movements after the eugenics movement, political activism has increased inclusivity, racial justice, and equality. By those, like coloured skinned people, receiving access to a formal diagnosis, more ethnic groups and races have increased the diagnosis rate to autism. It is then further increased by we are now diagnosing adults as well as children. Autism activism has reduced the stigma, but by reducing stigmatization and the stereotypes, more people have felt safer to reach out for a diagnosis. Wealthy countries have made screening children routine, increasing the chance to diagnose more people as autistic. We have learned that autism presents itself differently between boys and girls, and we were not always aware of these differences in the past, so the autism diagnostic criteria was gender biased. Because of this bias, girls were being misdiagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Diagnostic criteria for autism was based on tests done on males, typically white males. Females were left out of the research. Autism and other neurodivergent disabilities have lots of overlapping traits, so it's very easy to mistake one condition for another. Now that we know this, professionals know to be more cautious during the diagnosis process. It's been found it's possible that exposure to anti-epileptic drugs increase the probability of having an autistic child. Since a lot of autistic people also have epilepsy, autistic women who do will experience both exposure to anti-epileptic drugs and have the genetic mutations which are associated with autism, making it even more likely to have an autistic child. An association between illnesses during pregnancy and autism has been found. People who believe the conspiracy that vaccines cause autism won't treat illnesses that can be prevented or cured by vaccines. This then takes us onto our processed food and fast foods. Today's foods are increasing obesity, diabetes, and gut problems. Gastrointestinal problems cause an imbalance between the good and bad bacteria in the small intestine. This imbalance, technically called dysbiosis, activates the sympathetic nervous system and sends neuroinflammation to the brain. This occurs through complex bidirectional communication along the gut-brain axes, involving neural, immune, and endocrine pathways. The neuroinflammation can disrupt brain development, causing developmental delays. As one more example, other distinct disabilities have merged with autism. If you look at the graph, you'll see as autism is rising, intellectual disability is reducing. Instead of receiving a diagnosis of intellectual disability, they receive a diagnosis of autism. The viewpoint that autism and other forms of neurodivergence are so-called bad raises the question, why has autism persisted among our populations for hundreds of thousands of years? When we look at our ancient ancestry, we can see that the advantageous traits neurodivergent people exhibit promoted the survival of our species. I'm not denying the obstacles disabilities put in our way. But what I say is that ability and disability are working in contrary motion. Neurodivergent people are closer to the extremes of the normal distribution curve. Because there is opposition in all things, the enhancement of specific abilities deprives the person of the opposite. As an example, in autistic people, neuroscience has shown the brains of autistic people use the back of the brain more. The back of the brain is more attracted to the objective world, depriving them of attraction to the social world. This is why we see some autistic children more attracted to activities and objects in isolation to the level we can describe it as obsessional. The disconnection from the social world enables autistic people to be more reflective of the social world and approach problems in a way offering new potential solutions, greater creativity, and more independent thinking. Because of neurodivergence, autistic people are more logical in their perspectives and ways of approaching the world. Autistic people have far greater attraction to detail and greater visual skills. Because of the detail, they address all the details of their perspective, including the implications and underlying assumptions of their views. Neurotypicals, by habit, dismiss information that seems to be irrelevant. By autistic people holding on to both the relevant and irrelevant information, there's fewer gaps and holes within their way of thinking. We need to remember autism is primarily genetic. In genetics, there's a process called mutagenesis. Mutagenesis produces genetic mutations. Molecular biologist Miroslav Radman points out, I quote, "Mutagenesis has traditionally been viewed as an unavoidable consequence of imperfections in the process of DNA replication and repair. But if diversity is essential to survival, and if mutagenesis is required to generate such diversity, perhaps mutagenesis has been positively selected for throughout evolution." End of quote. To survive as one species, diversity and relatedness are both essential. Genetic diversity increases the resilience of our species, but we need to be genetically related to remain as one species. Today, we're approximately 95% genetically identical to the ape family. Anciently, we were even more genetically related to apes. As we became less genetically related, evolution separated us into a separate species. That illustrates we cannot remain as one species without being genetically related. T.H. Morgan says, I quote, "The discovery that the same mutation happens over and over again, not only within the same species, but in different species, is, I think, one of the most interesting discoveries in recent genetic work. It means that certain kinds of changes in the germ material are more likely to occur than are others. The appearance of new variations in the hereditary material is something less of a random process than we had hitherto supposed." End of quote. If new variations are not a process of randomness, the mutations associated with neurodivergence have a purpose in the natural world. Why would nature naturally select what it doesn't need? Our problem with the way we respond to disability is we treat people in an individualistic state instead of a collective state. Disability is not always the result of an embodiment, but is the result of how two embodiments interact with each other. Autistic people can socialize fine with other autistic people. Non-autistic people can socialize fine with other non-autistic people. But when an autistic person interacts with a non-autistic person, that's when we begin to see social issues occur. This shows social issues are not specifically to do with the autism, but we can see the social issues emerge when people who experience the world differently interact. The disability is produced by a group of people, not from one individual. We see the same when we look at how other living organisms interact with each other. There's the saying, if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. End of quote. Imagine we were watching a bird and a dog. If we judge them through a one-size-fits-all model, normalizing the natural world, we would start saying dogs are disabled because they can't fly like the birds. But is the dog actually disabled? No. Judging the whole world by the standard of a bird results in saying all other animals are disabled, diseased, or disordered. The same applies to humans. If we judge neurodivergent people by the standard of neurotypical people, the same between the bird and the dog happens to people. Normality produces disability. Disability doesn't arise from the person, him or herself. We only see something as disabled when we judge that thing by a standard that doesn't fit its nature. I'll demonstrate this by judging a neurotypical person by the standard of an autistic person. I can say non-autistic people have detailed deficiency. They have deficient concentration, deficient performance of interests. I could go on and on about the deficiencies when we compare non-autistic people to autistic people. Does that make non-autistic people deficient? No. So are neurodivergent people deficient, as normality presupposes? No. Disabilities are produced by judging the world with one lens. Normality disables and vilifies human diversity. Evelyn Fox Keller wrote, I quote, "We now know that mechanisms for enduring genetic stability are a product of evolution. Yet, a surprising number of mutations, in which at least some of these mechanisms are disabled, have been found in bacteria living under natural conditions. Why do these mutants persist? Is it possible they provide some selective advantage to the population as a whole? Might the persistence of some mutated genes in a population enhance the adaptability of that population? Apparently so. New mathematical models of bacterial populations in variable environments confirm that, under such conditions, selection favours the fixation of some mutated alleles, and furthermore, that their presence accelerates the pace of evolution." End of quote. So, why is autism persisting? Nature does not judge the world through one lens. Nature judges nature by its nature. It doesn't judge a bird by the nature of a dog. It judges a dog by the nature of a dog. So if we judge an autistic person by the nature of an autistic person, we won't see disability or deficiency. We will see the value and beauty of human diversity. Jerry Bergman writes, I quote, "Of the identified diseases, over 5,000 are a result of heritable mutations, and none of these 5,000 existed in our past before the mutation causing it was introduced into the human gene pool. As these mutations accumulate, a deterioration of the genome called devolution results, an event that is the opposite of the eugenics goal of trying to create the most flawless race and then limit reproduction to members of this race. This goal is flawed because the accumulation of mutations tends to result in all races becoming less perfect." End of quote. Trying to normalize genetics, claiming some genes are healthier than others, looking at genetics through one genetic lens, causes genetic deficiency, vilifying genetic diversity, making humans less adaptable to environmental changes. Diseases are geographical. Specific diseases are more dominant in specific areas of the world, and specific genetic mutations protect people from specific diseases. Health is having a harmonious relationship between the body, mind, and environment. Migrants are more likely to catch diseases. They developed in one environment that was more balanced with their body and mind. Immigrating to a foreign area of the world exposes migrants to foreign germs and pathogens that were not in the environment from which they came. Their body and mind may still be in balance, but the foreign environment they have moved to does not have a harmonious relationship with the migrant's body and mind. Look at the rest of the natural world. Can you think of any non-human animals that immigrate to foreign habitats, or do they all stay in a specific habitat they have developed a balanced relationship with? Dr. Gavin Mattei writes, I quote, "The suppression of individual authenticity plays havoc with biology, breeding illness. Even greater mayhem will ensue for bodies belonging to groups whose self-suppression has been systematically imposed, often with great violence." End of quote. Normality systematically imposes the standard of neurotypical people onto neurodivergent people, which makes them self-suppress individual authenticity, which breeds illness. If you look at the graph, you'll see at the start of the 20th century, less than 10% of Americans developed chronic disease. Today, approximately 70% of people have developed chronic disease. During the eugenics movement in the early 20th century, normality was embraced. The intensity of normality imposed on people correlated with an increase of chronic disease to this day in 2025. Adopting normality is what's generating the chronic disease epidemic in our world. Normality is the disease. Embracement of neurodiversity is the cure and solution to the chronic disease epidemic. That's why autism and other forms of neurodivergence persists, why the genetic mutations persist. I would like to close with a quote. "The fact that millions of people share the same vices does not make these vices virtues. The fact that they share so many errors does not make the errors to be truths. And the fact that millions of people share the same forms of mental pathology does not make these people sane." Eric Fromm, The Sane Society. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this content, please subscribe.